Thank you both. That was fascinating and really thought-provoking. And you both mentioned that one of the things you really want to get into here is regulation, and how do we do this, and how do we make people move in these directions. Andrew, you mentioned that there are certain ways that are good right now, that we know the right type of farming to do, for example, to give the biggest bang for our buck in terms of wildlife. And Steve, you just said all of these great examples of where we're doing this right. So what's the rub if we know the right way to do it, and there are examples of people who have the right idea, what's not moving fast enough? Why aren't we going there?
I guess a lot of these ideas are quite novel, and they run counter to the way we've done things for a long time. And at the moment, quite a lot of interests in land use, for instance, benefit from the way that we are doing things at the moment. So the way subsidies are structured at the moment incentivize people in a very different direction. And that means there's a whole load of people and organizations and institutions that are doing quite well out of the system, even though society as a whole or biodiversity might not. And so there's a lot of resistance to that sort of change. So you see that, in my own country in Europe, where farming policy is run out of Brussels, and it's very strong lobbies that push it in a particular direction, which favor the people that which favors the people that fund those lobbies, but which isn't, I would argue, the best outcome we could have, even for ourselves, even without thinking about anything else. So there's a real uphill struggle trying to reverse that, and part of that is then imagining what those interventions that could switch things around would be, and then beginning to talk to people, beginning the conversation that people say, well, actually, did you know you're paying this much to do the wrong thing? How about we just begin to have a conversation about how it would, what it would take to switch direction. And part of that is not only about identifying those alternative, better potential outcomes, but also I think not only knowing that it might be better to go down that route overall, but being explicit about who the winners and the losers in that will be. Because those will then be the people that will perhaps benefit most from a switch, and also the ones who are going to oppose it most. You can identify that, and that's a very important part of that. So breaking down those sorts of diagrams that Steve was showing that society would be better off perhaps if we can get into that win-win. Actually, that may be true, but within that there will be some losers and some winners, and we need to break it down to know who those will be before we can begin to identify the constituents that are going to be at the nub of that discussion.
But it seems like from what you're talking about that at least in some ways the farming community are winners in this. You're asking the farming community to have a higher yield on this amount of land rather than share the land. So why isn't the farming lobby going along with you on this?
So that's one part of it. We're saying that from what we've found, high yield farming is part of the solution, but it's only part of the solution if it's coupled with land sparing, and that means taking land out of production in places that are already largely converted, like the UK, for instance, or parts of the US. So that means that some farmers in that system would have high-yielding land that other people might take their entire farms out of production. So how do you come up with interventions that are equitable across that piece? How do you invent a system that means that those people who give up farming cows but are actually farming carbon or nature instead, how do they get a reward for that? And how do you link those two outcomes together? And that gets to be more complicated, well, obviously very complicated.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, so part of this is perception. I know in Minnesota, so we're in the Midwest, and there is oftentimes it's almost, it's like Washington, D.C. It gets to be sort of ritualized conflict. You're from the environmental community. You must not know farming, or what you're saying must be antagonistic to farming interests. And likewise, the farming, it's like, well, you want to do that? Oh, the environmental community. So part of this is just perception, and there's where science really helps. You can come in, you can work through the facts, and if you can have a rational discussion, break down some of these stereotypes and say, there are cases here where, in fact, doing well for the environment is not doing worse for farming communities and vice versa. So there are some win-wins or whatever. But there are real trade-offs, and even when there are win-wins over for society, just as Andrew said, there are cases where there's going to be a particular party that's hurt. Like, I'm going to say your farm is really important for biodiversity or water quality. So you have to know who the winners and losers are, how they're winning and losing, and we have to have enough flexibility in the political system and in our institutions to basically make people whole. So we say, all right, overall we're doing well as a society by making this change. Let's take some of that gain from elsewhere. Let's make sure that you're being made whole, that you're not sacrificing for the good of the community, and devise this. I mean, we do this in other arenas. If we want to build a roadway and we take somebody's property, we compensate. So there are mechanisms for doing this. We haven't been so flexible or creative yet in the environmental space, but hopefully we will.
So is it a marketing problem? Because, I mean, there are areas where that works, and
Yes.
not everybody, certainly in Vermont, we know that there's some unhappiness with eminent domain at this very moment.
Yes.
But I can't see a politician winning on a strategy of saying, I'm going to preserve grassland habitat by taking some of this private land out of commission and getting elected. So is the environmental movement not very good at marketing? Because we're talking about short-term gain versus long-term gain and sustainability.
So we actually do, interestingly enough, have a program in this country where it's not eminent domain, but the Conservation Reserve Program actually pays farmers
Right.
to take land out of production and put it into grasslands or other perennial vegetation for precisely these regions. Now, I think you're right to focus on the fact that eminent domain is not very popular, which is why most of these programs are voluntary. You take that off, and now you actually are saying, well, if people are volunteering to do this, it must, we're not forcing them to do it. So there are ways of doing this. My one criticism of things like the Conservation Reserve Program is you really want to not just take all comers, and they try to do this, they try to target, but you really want to think carefully about where are the important areas for water quality or biodiversity. And this is where it's hard politically, because now I'm going to say, well, I'm going to pay a lot for your land because it's environmentally valuable, but I'm not going to pay a lot for your land. But
But is that what needs to be
biologically,
done?
you really want to do that, yes.
And do we need to do that?
I think we do. There's some statistics about, really focusing, like if you're on water quality, there are some crucial parts of the landscape, steeply sloped or close to rivers. You absolutely want to target those. Land that's further away or flatter, much less important for that. So if water quality is an interest, you definitely want to target.
And that's
Andrew,
the
you were
case of
saying yes,
biodiversity too. I mean, there are places where it's going to be much more valuable to try and spare land than in others, where there's higher biodiversity value anyway, where the opportunity cost in terms of lost agricultural production might be lower. That's not an excuse for sort of saying, right, we're going to farm lowland England in my case and not farm Scotland. It's not at that scale, but at some intermediate scale between that and the size of a farm, there are places where it makes sense to concentrate your conservation investments. And that's politically unpopular. So at the moment, agricultural subsidies in Europe as a whole, in the UK in particular, have gone on the basis of let's spread them everywhere. And in the environmental strand of those subsidies, that means everybody wants to get a payment for the environment. Well, actually, they're not doing much for the environment. And they're not going to be able to do very much for the environment. These other people could do much more. That's politically unpopular, but would deliver much more. So there are some hard and difficult things that you are going to need some politicians or leaders to be able to bite the bullet and promote.
I was going to ask you, how do you get people to overlook their short-term interests in the face of what is in the long term necessary, and even more in their best interest and in our best interest if we'd like to have a population that can sustain itself? But it sounds like what you're both saying is money. We need to focus environmental efforts and dollars at the most important and most strategic targets. So is it all about the money?
I don't think it's all about the money. I think people are actually much more concerned about these things in other ways too. In fact, one of the things we're doing this week is thinking about all the other things that influence decision making besides the money, and how you can promote some of those. But it certainly does help with a lot of decision makers, and it brings a lot of people to the table who might not otherwise be interested. You don't always necessarily have to turn it into money. But it can be in terms of palpable material self-interest. One of my favorite examples comes from a fog forest in extreme western Ecuador, incredibly important place for biodiversity west of the Andes. For a long time, conservationists had tried the traditional conservation method of going to poor villages and saying, your land is incredibly important for nature on behalf of the planet. Do the right thing and don't cut down the forests. And for decades that failed. Some smart biologist actually was then sitting there for a while thinking, hang on a minute, what do the people get out of this forest? Is there any reason they might want to keep it? Noticed that this intercepts fog coming off the ocean during the dry season, keeps their fields wet downstream. Then went and worked with the villagers to measure that fog interception in places where they'd left the forest, places that they hadn't, found there was a huge impact on people's ability to farm. The next door village that had cut down its forest couldn't farm in the dry season anymore. People saw that, and within 3 months, after decades of conservationists trying their usual arguments, the people decided to set aside the forest. No money changed hands, but it was an argument that was expressed in terms of a material gain to the village.
I was going to say, I don't think it's actually about the money at all. It's really about what kind of society we want to live in, and what kinds of benefits are we actually getting. And so Andrew just gave a really nice example of, if we maintained the cloud forest, we get these kinds of benefits. It's really nice when the benefits accrue back to the people who are making the decision. A little bit tougher when you've got the upstream, downstream issue. And, I think actually that's where the money comes in, because you have to basically say you've got a mismatch between those, in a sense, who are bearing costs and those who are getting the benefits. But ultimately, it really is about the benefits that you're getting. You're trying to get clean water, and the value of that clean water far exceeds whatever destructive land use was going on upstream.
When you talk about what kind of culture we want to have and trying to get people to think really deeply about that, I think that is something that Vermonters pay a lot of attention to. And we have created policies, governmental policies, community policies, that are geared towards preserving the landscape and having small-scale communities, thinking a lot about sustainable agriculture. But based on what you're both saying, that's not necessarily going to save Vermont from some of the problems that the world is facing. When we think about the fact that most Vermonters value not living inside tight-knit towns and cities. We like to live out in the country. We like to have land. That's not good when we talk about having land that is preserved without any breaks in it, any kind of habitation. Our biggest greenhouse gas emissions come from our transportation sector, and that's part of having a very rural state and a rural economy. And if we want to get to a better place in terms of emissions, we're going to have to deal with that in the way we've structured our communities. So Vermont is in this interesting place in terms of trying to think very hard about these issues and care about them profoundly, but also how do we then change or adjust what to us is the most important value, our landscape and our natural working landscape, into something that's actually sustainable.
Yep, I think that's a real
Well
challenge. I agree. And you see the same in communities like that in the UK, where you have people who very much want to do the right thing, and sometimes, if you stand back and take a hard-nosed view at it, what appeals, or what is perhaps a popular way of trying to do that, that may not actually be quite as good as some alternatives that may seem at first less palatable. So one would be, as you say, going and living out in the country. Another would be, what size gardens do you want? You can play the land sparing sharing game with urban planning. It's exactly the same. Should you have clustered housing, or should you have bigger towns, bigger footprints, but everyone's got birds in their garden? And it turns out when you do the numbers, you get the same answers. Biodiversity would prefer us to live in high-rise flats and have very good parks, very good national parks, or nature reserves, whatever, coming right onto our doorstep. So that's and there's a similar one around organic food production in a way, in that that may reduce the on-farm chemical use perhaps, but if the footprint is if the yields are lower, then the overall footprint may be greater. So there's a difficult trade-off there that's unsettling, I think, for people trying to do the right thing necessarily to think about.
So one thing that I completely agree. I mean, there are these trade-offs. I mean, we all kind of want to live in an idyllic, isolated place without a lot of neighbors, maybe. But if we all try to do that, of course, it's self-defeating. So But I think the thing that I'd like to mention is where you started. Vermont as a community is actually thinking about these issues and trying. So I talked about markets, and markets certainly have a role, but political and community action and thinking as a town or thinking as a state together about, well, what trade-offs do we want to make? What kind of society do we have? And the reason why I mention this, so as I said, I've been going to China, and it's a really interesting contrast. Within a week's time period, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in China. And, Washington, D.C., as we all know right now, is just dysfunctional. We are not making decisions. The kind of talk that we would be having here, it's just not happening, at least when it's going through Congress and the administration. So, but in China, for better or worse, whatever you think about the ruling Communist Party, if science comes in, and in fact I've seen this, if science comes in and says, here are the consequences, and this is, from your understanding of what the Chinese people want, if you say you could do this, but it's going to cause you these kinds of damages, that actually gets listened to, and there's a filter in the U.S. right now, which is you're either free market or you're against free market. It's like we actually have a rich set of institutions, and some of our issues fit very nicely in having markets do things, and others like this, like how do we organize landscape? That is not something that markets are good at doing without some type of political or community discussion about what we want it to look like.
We are seeing globally, though, a push for more people to move to cities. That is where the migratory patterns are happening. People are moving into cities. So we will, in theory, then, have a landscape that we can decide what we want to do with. But then you also have this disconnect between people who are living in those high rises and don't have a connection to nature and to the landscape, or you don't have the people who are doing that farming, so you have these huge, large-scale industrial farms. So how do you then advocate for people to move into population-dense regions and have those patterns, but also have this connection that we feel so strongly about in Vermont, and that helps us understand our landscape and care for it?
I think that's a really important point. It's something that's been worrying me for a very long time. We did a project about 10 years ago in the UK where we asked school kids. I got interested because my kids were that age and they were running around with field guides. And then one stage they had a friend over and they had a field guide to Pokemon. I didn't realize there was such a thing, but you can get looks like a Peterson field guide, but it has Pokemon creatures in it. And you could cover up one bit of it and they would tell you all the characters, just like my children would say, they'd say, that's
Pikachu.
Yeah, exactly. So they could identify things from the characters or from it. It was fantastic. So we did a little experiment where we showed school kids images of 4 or 5 out of 100 species that they, like a bluebell or a tree or a deer, or an oak tree or a red deer or something like that they might reasonably expect to be able to put a name to, and the same for Pokemon. And we found that before they got to school, they knew a little bit more about their own natural history. They knew. This was where we live, is relatively quiet part of the world, so they didn't know much about Pokemon at that stage. By the time they got to about 7, they knew about the same, about Pokemon and about natural history, and after that they got less and less interested in natural history, and they got more and more interested in Pokemon. So that disconnect is real, and it worries me. And we want to try and do those kind of trade-offs with nature connection as one of the benefits that we're at risk of losing if we. But it's not clear to me exactly how that would work out. So it may well be the case that having a more black and white world like that would result in reduced nature connection. But it might not. There was more black on that right-hand landscape, the Sperry landscape, than there was on the left-hand landscape. So actually, you may not have nature quite as close, but when you do get into nature, it may be much more like nature and less like gardens. So I'm not quite sure how that trade-off works, but it does worry me about the kind of models we're coming up with. We haven't yet dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, in my own life, this is on a very small scale and not at all what you're talking about, but I have this constant problem wanting to pick up wildlife. I want to touch it. I want to pick up the salamander. I want to catch the bird. I want to catch the snake, which I realize is stressing the animals and not good for them, but it gives me this great understanding of how they move and how they feel and what they look like and what their tongues do that I wouldn't have if I didn't touch them. So you do have that. If you don't have people interacting with nature or with their food and understanding where their food comes from, it's hard to feel a connection to, caring about what our agriculture looks like and the people who are producing it. So this is also going to be heresy in Vermont, but are GMOs the answer?
I would say they're part of the answer. So our view, we are completely agnostic about how you get high yields, provided two things. One is that they have lower externalities per unit of production, and the second is that there's some way then of linking them to sparing land. There are lots of other issues around any of the technologies that you might think of, and GM presents quite a few. But we're interested potentially in thinking about rice fish co-culture been going on for 4,000 years in parts of China and Japan, right through to GMOs via integrated pest management in the middle. And we're looking at across the piece. I think it's very important to be agnostic and to evaluate these things on the evidence. And I see something which worries me a little bit with the mood towards GM in Europe over the past 10 or 15 years, which is some of the people we work with on this stuff are agricultural technologists who are working to come up with GM or all sorts of non-GM techniques, but that take chemicals out of the equation. Their vision is a landscape where you don't have to put in pesticides except in extreme circumstances, where plants are much better at scavenging, so you can put on scavenging minerals, so you put on much less fertilizer and so on. When they come up with trials for their products, not only does it cost them a lot more than with other techniques to get them to the stage of having a plant that does this, then the field trials cost them hundreds of thousands of pounds per trial to protect the trial, have a double fence barrier, wire fence barrier around the whole thing, have guards patrolling day and night to stop the crop being destroyed. And what that does is it forces GM, this is a state organization, it can hardly afford to do any GM. The only people that can are increasingly very big agribusiness who are never going to do that for cassava and for crops that I care about in tropical communities because there's no money. So if we rule it out through that kind of activity in my country, I think poorer people lose out and the environment might lose out.
Steve, do you take a perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, like Andrew, I'm very pragmatic about this. I mean, this has been, I know, a really emotional issue for many people, and it's hard in the following sense. It's like, you know, if you're doing something which is new, it's hard necessarily to know what all the ramifications are and so forth. But we do a lot of things in agriculture right now which we know are very destructive. I mean, you come out to my part of the country in the Midwest, I mean, it's, you know, wall-to-wall corn and soybeans, and the water quality, basically in southern Minnesota, you know, all of the water basically is on the impaired list. You know, we do not have species other than the ones that are your winners, the small subset of the native fauna that actually can tolerate this. So it's incredibly intensive agriculture. So if there are ways to do this in a way which is safe and which is reducing the destructive actions of current industrial agricultural processes, and I'd say let's pursue this avenue. So I'm not an expert in this, but I would say let's be pragmatic and compare, not the perfect or whatever to, because we don't have the perfect now. We have industrial agriculture which has many negative environmental consequences. And the point is, how do we get out of that, produce the food, but not the negative consequences?
In terms of producing the food, do we fundamentally, though, need to control our population? And in doing that, do we need to have regulations? Do we need to have countries that are saying we are actually going to make it more difficult for you to have more children?
Interesting question. I think population is a huge issue here. We're talking about going from 7 to 9 to 10 billion in 50 years. And even though population growth is decelerating, and we're probably not going to double global population size again, and that's a marvelous thing for our grandchildren, I think. Nevertheless, the population is growing very fast, and I think it's for individual countries and people to decide. But there are plenty of.
You don't think there needs to be some sort of
Well, I don't think you're going to get a UN decision, ratified on population. I can't imagine that happening. It'd be even more difficult than getting agreement on climate change, I suspect.
Yeah.
But China did do that, and according to some interesting evidence from the Pew, for instance, who go in and look at Chinese attitudes to things, a lot of Chinese people are quite happy that they did that was done. And having said all of that, if you look at the numbers, in terms of total consumption, not just food, but in terms of total consumption, that's the product of the number of people and per capita consumption. Over that interval where we're going from 6 to 9 billion, that's 50% increase in number of people, per capita wealth, pretty closely related to consumption, is going to go up by between 3 and 4-fold. So if we want to think what's really driving the multiple at the end, it's both of those things. But unless we get a handle on this incessant feeling of entitlement that we can have more and more at each successive generation, then that's to me the really big one, not population. I mean, they're both important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but just to pick up on that, so we're at 7 billion now. In, say, 2050, we be 9 billion. I mean, so there's an increase there, but it's not like the exponential growth that we saw, let's say, between 1950 and 2000. We basically went from 3 to 6 billion. Okay, so population growth is a concern. It puts more pressure on resources. So, to the extent that we can limit that gives us space. But as Andrew said, if you look at where the pressure is going to come from going forward, it's actually rising incomes, and what happens with rising incomes is that people want to eat meat. And if you think about what's really putting pressure on cropland and what we need to do, it's not population per se, it's the switch to meat consumption. So it's like 8 to 1 conversion, calories in animals. So, we got to grow 8 times, So that's a huge issue. And in fact, looking forward, if you think about the increase in required calories, whatever, most of that is actually not population driven. It's diet driven, or like in my part of the world, we made this decision or in the US, we made a decision to say, hey, why don't we produce ethanol? So most of the corn that's grown in Minnesota does not go to feed people. It goes to feed cows and cars. So, that if we're really worried about that kind of pressure, that's something that we would change.
So the conspiracy theorists were right. It's your types that were behind that news this week that bacon causes cancer.
We've been rumbled.
We're here at a university. We're here where there are so many young people who think about these issues, and for all the good work that the two of you are doing, you and your generation are not the ones who are going to ultimately have to push this forward as we move to 2030, 40, 50, and beyond. So what is the message that you're trying to give out to young people who are already thinking in these realms and trying to figure out, first of all, what do we do? And second of all, thanks a lot for giving us this situation.
Yeah. No, I mean, frankly, when I teach my classes or come to universities, I'd say, put the pressure on the corporations and the business people and, frankly, academics like us. Like, what are you doing to leave us with a world like you found it, or at least as well off? I mean, so that's this whole issue about sustainability. Are we leaving to the next generation at least as good a situation as we found? And as you said, I think in many dimensions, our generation has failed the next generation. So, I think it comes back to your first question about, how do we move this? So some of this is science, just getting the facts and showing the consequence. Like, the problem is it's meat consumption, say, or whatever it is. So that's part of it. But the other parts of it are being politically in tune and active. Organizing your own lifestyle so that you're doing this more sustainably. But so there's many different dimensions: scientific, political, personal lifestyle. do them all. Why not?
But as you just mentioned, when you go to Washington and you work there, you see a total logjam. So,
Yeah.
that's demoralizing for many people, but particularly for people who are perhaps thinking about what's my career going to be and where am I going to be able to make a difference.
No, that's very true. I sometimes suffer. It's very good to go back to Minnesota or come to Vermont. As I think if you spent too much time in D.C., you would be sort of permanently demoralized. I don't have an answer on that. I guess my answer is always there usually are multiple ways of getting to an end. Right now, I would not advocate spending a whole lot of time trying to lobby Congress. It's just, that's not going to move things. Showing what can be done in a small state like Vermont or in your town. Oftentimes there's real power in a specific example of people showing a different way. And I'll give you an example of that. So the water funds that I mentioned, that started from New York City. But really where it spread in Latin America is in Quito, Ecuador. They said, hey, New York City did this. Why don't we try this here in Quito? It was very successful there. The Nature Conservancy helped kind of to spread this idea, but basically, the idea was very clear to people, like, oh, if we want to protect our water, we ought to be doing things upstream. And it makes sense to people, and Quito showed how you actually can do it. So, I would say if you're blocked at one level, go another route and find a place where you actually can make a difference. And oftentimes, even if you're just doing it in one small town in Vermont, if you provide kind of the right key, the right insight, that can spread.
I'd agree with that. I spent a while a few years back trying to write, feeling exactly like, as you were suggesting, feeling pretty despondent, and then realizing that's part of the problem in itself, and that if we give people just some hopeless choice between despair and denial, which is what you could accuse conservation and the environmental movement of doing at times, then you're not going to get anywhere, and you have to offer people ideas that the notion, the state of mind that means that things can progress. And if you, for that exercise, I spent a while visiting a whole load of places where things are moving forward, and they are. And you can celebrate those. You can celebrate them both to learn from them and try and, but also just as a general sort of message that this isn't inevitable. We have a choice. We've lost. Depending on how you do the sums, we've lost about half of nature over the last since the Industrial Revolution. So there's is nature's glass half full or half empty? Well, it's up to you to decide, but if you decide it's half empty, then I guess all bets are off. If you think it's half full and you start thinking of ways that it can be, that you can slow its draining, then then you can begin to move forward. And the interesting thing, I think, both from the research angle and then also kind of from the real world, real politic angle, is that if you look at what I think are the interesting examples where things are being turned around and where you can gain something, it's from thinking in lateral ways. So we've gone at this problem for a long time, this is a conventional biological science. We'll find out species are going down the pan, you need to do this, we'll tell politicians and they'll do it. And the world doesn't work like that, and it may not have worked ever like it certainly doesn't work like it now. And what you need to do is, on the research side, it's about a whole load of different disciplines coming together. The answers are really about human behavior, not about animal behavior, for instance. So it's a lot about natural and social scientists working with one another, along with all sorts of other disciplines. And on the applied side, this is not about the conventional agents of conservation solving the problem. It's about them working with all sorts of other sectors of society, mainstreaming the problem and finding novel allies, new ways forward, often ones based on the kind of results that Steve was talking about, which deliver wins in unexpected ways for people who weren't part of that discussion. And then you find new ways forward because you have new allies, new friends.
And fundamentally, you do have hope? When you go to bed at night and pull the covers up, you're not demoralized?
I'll wait till after Paris, but apart from the Paris, no, in general I do, yeah.